The transcript begins in the state of Texas versus Raymond Peoples. Peoples is representing himself and is called forward to testify. He immediately begins discussing his history with the criminal justice system, saying that his first criminal charge came when he was 27. He claims that he has been mistreated by powerful people in government and alleges that a shock device attached to his leg has been used to stop him from talking about prior cases. He says officials hate him because of who he is rather than because of what he has done. He announces that he intends to explain everything that has happened since his first criminal charge in 2016, saying that the matters he will discuss are supported by records or witnesses. He also tells the jury that he plans to educate them about laws and rules that he believes authorities have repeatedly violated. Peoples stresses that this is his fourth trial and claims that the only time authorities obtained a conviction against him was when a jury was not involved. He describes that earlier conviction as a probation violation arising from a charge that, in his opinion, should have been handled in misdemeanor court rather than felony court. The judge immediately intervenes and explains that Peoples is on trial for a first-degree felony aggravated assault against a public servant. The judge tells him that the current proceeding is not an opportunity to give the jury a speech about his entire life. Peoples is instructed repeatedly to remain relevant to the charge and to stop interrupting the court. The judge explains that the court must direct the law to the parties and jury, and that the trial must focus on matters within the four corners of the indictment. The judge also explains that if the case reaches the punishment phase, Peoples can present appropriate information about punishment, but at this stage he must address the allegations themselves. Peoples tries to continue discussing the jury selection process, but the judge again tells him that events concerning jury selection are not the facts of the alleged incident, and that he must move forward. Peoples then raises the Sixth Amendment and argues that he has a constitutional right to a speedy public trial by an impartial jury. He discusses the meaning of impartiality and the right to confront witnesses. He says a witness who testified had stated that Peoples scratched him and caused an injury, while Peoples says he was nevertheless indicted for stabbing the man with ink. He then moves into broader constitutional arguments about citizenship and due process. He cites principles concerning people born or naturalized in the United States and argues that the government cannot deprive him of life, liberty, or property without due process. Peoples insists that he should be allowed to tell the jury how he believes his rights have been violated. The judge stops him again and explains that representing himself does not remove the requirement to follow courtroom rules. The judge tells Peoples that the law has rules, the rules of evidence have rules, and a self-represented defendant must follow them. The judge says that constitutional arguments are not relevant to the immediate question, and that the judge will provide the law while Peoples should provide his version of the facts. The judge repeatedly asks him not to speak over the court and reminds him that the people in the courtroom have valuable time. When Peoples makes another statement the judge considers improper, the judge warns that another such statement could result in contempt of court. Peoples says he is trying to testify about the facts and asks whether he can act as a character witness for himself. The judge explains that character evidence is generally a matter for the punishment phase and that the current stage is about the facts surrounding the allegations. Peoples complains that his character has been attacked for the previous 2 days and says he had objected. The judge responds that he should have objected properly and that the matter can be handled through the proper procedure. Peoples then attempts to object to the jury selection. The judge overrules the objection and says that if Peoples wants to make that argument, it can be addressed outside the presence of the jury. The judge emphasizes that the jurors need to hear the facts of the alleged offense, not Peoples's personal feelings about the court or the proceedings. Peoples continues to press the point, but the judge repeatedly states that the ruling has been made and orders him to move forward. Peoples then turns his attention to the jury and says his family is watching the proceeding. He speaks about integrity, dignity, and perseverance. He alleges that every juror in the county is connected to a law enforcement officer and argues that he is being forced to appear before a jury that is not made up of his peers. He says he has lawsuits pending against the judge and a federal district judge and describes the jury situation as completely illegal and unconstitutional. He claims that several jurors had close relationships with people involved in his case. He also alleges that one juror was related to the officer who arrested him and that the officer had broken his phone and destroyed evidence. Peoples refers to a previous trial and says he remains in prison for pointing a gun at someone. He emphasizes that he did not shoot the gun and questions why that conduct resulted in an aggravated assault charge. He continues discussing his prior probation, saying that investigators tried to find a way to violate him, even though his probation officer had documented that he had been compliant for 3 years. Peoples then makes accusations concerning the prosecutors, commenting on their racial backgrounds and suggesting that the prosecution team was arranged to create an appearance that racism was not involved. The judge intervenes when Peoples begins discussing subpoenas. Peoples says court clerks previously told him that he could not subpoena witnesses himself. The judge explains that defendants do have compulsory process rights, but subpoenas must be properly prepared and filed. The judge says that some of Peoples' subpoenas may have been inaccurate, incorrect, or improperly filed, and advises him to obtain legal assistance. The judge again tells him to focus on the actual aggravated assault allegation. Peoples returns to his claims about habeas corpus and alleged conspiracies. He says he filed a habeas corpus complaint in 2022 and believes that afterward he was harassed in jail and placed in isolation. He says he had been working in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and doing well before being transferred and placed in isolation after filing lawsuits. He becomes increasingly emotional and says he is willing to be electrocuted if authorities want to do that, while insisting that he wants the world to know what has happened to him. The judge tells him to behave properly and emphasizes that the courtroom is also governed by basic rules of common decency. The judge repeatedly reminds Peoples that the case concerns an allegation that he struck a public servant on the head and body. Peoples continues bringing up federal litigation, the Supreme Court, and alleged retaliation. The judge explains that the current case is a state criminal matter and is not a federal proceeding. Peoples cites federal statutes concerning interference with testimony and conspiracy, apparently attempting to use those provisions to support his arguments. The judge tells him that federal statutes have no direct relevance to the state charge being tried and explains that state law has its own elements and rules. The judge notes that he previously served as a United States attorney and therefore understands the distinction between federal and state law. Even after that explanation, Peoples continues questioning why authorities allegedly ate him. Peoples then describes his treatment in jail. He claims that after filing a lawsuit against a judge for refusing to issue a writ of habeas corpus, and after an attorney allegedly refused to provide him with search warrants, Lieutenant Ford began harassing him. He complains about the condition of his cell and says he repeatedly asked jail personnel to clean it or give him bleach and a towel so he could clean it himself and shower. He describes an argument over being placed in isolation and says he would not willingly cuff up because he believed officers intended to hurt him. He says he was willing to accept restraints if the purpose was to clean the cell but did not want to be taken to isolation. He denies swinging at anyone or threatening to stab anyone. Peoples claims that when he was placed in isolation, officers threw away his legal paperwork, legal books, and photographs of his children. He says these were items he could never replace. He also describes being searched after returning from court and claims that officers made him strip naked, squat, and cough while cameras were positioned so his entire body could be seen. He interprets these events as further evidence of retaliation and connects them to his complaints against judges and jail officials. He again invokes habeas corpus and argues that his constitutional rights have been violated. The judge stops the discussion and warns that continued interruptions could result in Peoples being removed from the courtroom or placed in a holding cell. The jury is excused while the judge attempts to control the proceeding. Peoples continues talking about his complaints against federal judges and jail officials. He claims that a federal judge eventually ruled against him and that he was transferred or removed from a previous placement afterward. The judge asks whether Peoples is claiming that the judge ordered sanctions against him in jail. Peoples says he believes Lieutenant Ford has been able to mistreat him because he filed complaints. The judge presses him for clarity, but Peoples continues connecting his incarceration, isolation, and jail treatment to his lawsuits. The prosecutor then presents a closing argument focused on the actual incident. The prosecutor argues that Peoples has repeatedly taken his complaints through appellate courts and has been denied relief, yet continues repeating the same accusations whenever he does not get the outcome he wants. The prosecutor describes the June 6, 2023 incident as a violent act and points to evidence that Peoples wrapped his hands in cloth, placed pins in them, and came out of his cell carrying a mattress. The prosecution argues that those actions showed preparation to harm someone. The prosecutor relies on Lieutenant Ford's testimony that Peoples lunged toward him while still holding the sharp pins and that Ford experienced pain and suffered scratches. The prosecution also addresses Peoples' complaints about the condition of his cell. Another officer, Darby, had gone to the cell and inspected it for roughly 30 or 40 seconds. According to the prosecutor, Darby did not return and confirm Peoples' allegations, and other officers later inspected the cell and found it acceptable. The prosecution argues that Peoples' claims about the cell were a distraction or smoke screen designed to make him appear mistreated whenever he did not get what he wanted. The prosecutor describes a pattern in which Peoples allegedly creates conflict, refuses instructions, and then presents himself as the victim. The prosecutor tells the jury that Peoples appears to believe everyone is against him, including judges, prosecutors, appellate courts, and even higher courts. The prosecutor rejects that theory and emphasizes that Peoples had previously pleaded guilty to an offense for which he was serving a 20-year sentence. The prosecutor explains that the jury does not have to agree on one particular mental state because the aggravated assault charge can be supported by intentional, knowing, or reckless conduct when the victim is a public servant performing a lawful duty. The prosecutor explains that jail officers were carrying out required procedures while working to make equipment safe, and that such procedures are necessary because inmates can leave their cells or attempt to escape. The prosecution also points to Peoples' conduct inside the jail, including arguments with officers, refusal to follow instructions, and alleged threats. The prosecutor references testimony that Peoples yelled that he was going to kill someone and used a racial slur, while deliberately not repeating the slur in court. The prosecutor argues that the conflict over a food tray demonstrates Peoples' continuing refusal to accept institutional rules. The prosecutor points to injuries suffered by Lieutenant Ford and argues that the sharp objects were not merely used to scratch the officer, but were swung toward him, including toward his eye. The prosecutor asks the jury not to feel sorry for Peoples and instead to hold him responsible, emphasizing that he does not control the jail, the courtroom, or the day. The prosecutor asks the jury to find him guilty and proceed to punishment. The jury returns a guilty verdict for aggravated assault against a public servant, as charged in the indictment. Even after the verdict, Peoples continues speaking and making outbursts. The prosecutor then addresses punishment, and explains that Peoples had previously been placed on probation with an opportunity to avoid a conviction if he followed the rules. The prosecutor says Peoples was given 10 years of probation and could potentially have completed it without a conviction if he behaved himself, but argues that his continued conduct demonstrates a pattern of refusing to follow rules and attempting to control everyone around him. The judge repeatedly tells Peoples that he has a legal right to make a final argument without interruption, but that he cannot interrupt the prosecution while the prosecutor is speaking. The court records several instances in which Peoples defies the judge's orders. The prosecution argues that his behavior may seem almost humorous in a courtroom but becomes dangerous in jail, where weapons and other objects are available, and where Peoples has allegedly thrown bodily waste at people, attempted to escape, and created serious problems for inmates and officers. The prosecutor stresses that Peoples is already serving a 20-year sentence, and that the possibility of additional punishment does not appear to deter him. The prosecutor asked for a substantial increase so that Peoples understands that he is not in control. As the jury is sent to deliberate, Peoples continues making comments and attempts to speak to the jurors as they leave. The judge tells him that addressing the jury in that manner is improper. During the recess, the court and prosecution note that Peoples has several pending filings and has pursued matters in the Supreme Court and other appellate courts, but that his requests have repeatedly been denied. The court then prepares for the punishment decision. When the jury returns, Peoples is asked to rise for sentencing but refuses. The jury announces that it assesses his punishment at 40 years of confinement in the Institutional Division of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. The court notes that Peoples was already serving a 20-year sentence, and that the new punishment must be stacked on top of that prior sentence. The judge therefore formally sentences Peoples to 40 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, with the new sentence beginning immediately after completion of the existing sentence. Even while the formal sentence is being read, Peoples continues speaking and interrupting. The court describes his conduct as obstreperous and notes that he has continued defying the court's rulings throughout the entire trial. The sentences are ordered to run consecutively as required, and Peoples is remanded to the custody of the Jefferson County Sheriff until the sentence can be carried out. The proceeding ends with the court noting that Peoples continued shouting over the judge while the formal judgment was being read and as he was being led away. The court specifically observes that Peoples had been given more leeway than any other defendant in the judge's history of 616 jury trials. But despite that opportunity, he remained defiant and refused to follow the court's instructions and orders through the very end.